1,500 kilometers. That is not the distance from one city to the next. That is the distance from London to Warsaw, from New York to Miami, and halfway back. It is a distance that, just 3 years ago, would have been considered impossible for a country the size of Ukraine, with the resources Ukraine has, to strike with precision, at scale, and with strategic intent. Zelensky just hit it. Ukrainian drones struck gas facilities in Russia's Orenburg region, deep in the southern Urals, over 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian front line. One of the world's largest natural gas fields, infrastructure that feeds Russia's domestic energy network and finances its military machine. Gone. Struck. Burning. And that was before the 500 drones that struck Moscow itself on the night of May 16th into May 17th, 2026. Before the fires in Khimki. Before the semiconductor plant hit. Before the oil refinery struck. Before the debris fell on Sheremetyevo Airport. And now, as the smoke clears over Moscow's suburbs, Vladimir Putin has responded. Not with restraint, not with genuine peace overtures, but with what analysts are calling his most dangerous strategic move since the invasion began. Tonight we go deep into what Zelensky's long-range strikes actually mean for the future of this war. We examine the technology, the strategy, and the implications. And we examine what Putin has just set in motion, and why it should alarm every serious observer of global security. Because what is happening right now is not a continuation of the war as we have known it. This is something new, something more dangerous, and something that will define the next phase of global geopolitics in ways that few people are yet fully prepared to reckon with. Let us start with the strikes themselves. To understand why hitting Orenburg at 1,500 kilometers is significant, you have to understand what it takes to conduct a precision strike at that range with drone technology. Modern military drones capable of long-range precision strike operations require several things simultaneously. They require a guidance system sophisticated enough to navigate hundreds of kilometers of hostile airspace, adapt to electronic jamming, and still find a specific building at the end of the journey. They require a propulsion system efficient enough to cover that distance without detection or interception. They require intelligence, real-time or near-real-time targeting data that tells you exactly where to strike for maximum effect. And they require the command and control infrastructure to coordinate multiple vehicles across multiple routes simultaneously. Ukraine has developed or acquired all of these capabilities, and the speed of that development, over just 4 years of full-scale war, represents one of the most significant military technology stories of the 21st century. The Orenburg strike was not a single drone. It was a coordinated operation against specific infrastructure chosen for its economic strategic value. The gas fields of Orenburg are not just energy assets. They are connected to the pipeline networks that distribute gas across Russia's industrial heartland. They are connected to the revenue streams that fund procurement of everything from artillery shells to drone components. Striking them is not an act of vandalism. It is economic warfare at strategic depth. And Ukraine's capacity for economic warfare at strategic depth is now demonstrably real. Consider the cumulative target list from just the past several weeks. The Krasnodar oil refinery, the Ilsky oil refinery, the Lukoil drilling rigs on the Caspian Sea, a body of water that Russia does not share a border with Ukraine across. The fertilizer plant linked to explosives production. The Novocherkassk thermal power plant in Rostov Oblast. A drone warehouse attached to Russia's 19th Motor Rifle Division in Zaporizhia Oblast. A Buk M3 missile system in Luhansk Oblast. And now Orenburg. And now Moscow. Each of these strikes, taken individually, represents a tactical success. Taken together, they represent a strategic campaign of escalating reach and ambition. A systematic effort to make the economic cost of this war felt not just at the front line, but deep inside Russian territory, by Russian civilians, in Russian cities that have until now been insulated from the reality of what their government is doing to Ukraine. The psychological dimension of this campaign is as important as the physical damage. For 4 years, the majority of Russia's population has consumed a media diet carefully curated by the Kremlin to present the war in Ukraine as a distant, victorious operation conducted by heroic soldiers against NATO aggression. Casualties have been hidden. Losses have been minimized. The coffins have arrived quietly, in small towns, without fanfare. But burning apartment buildings in Moscow's suburbs cannot be hidden. Flight cancellations at Sheremetyevo cannot be censored. Fires at oil refineries visible from satellite imagery cannot be suppressed with a fine. Russia has now introduced new laws banning the publication of photos, videos, or details about drone strike damage without official authorization. Violators face fines. The law itself is an admission, an acknowledgement that the information the Kremlin most fears is the information that Russian citizens are seeing with their own eyes. A poll released just days ago showed that for the first time since 2022, ordinary Russians are more worried about strikes on Russian territory than about casualties at the front. That is a seismic psychological shift. That is the beginning of the process by which wars become politically unsustainable for the governments prosecuting them. And this is precisely the strategic logic behind Zelensky's escalating deep strike campaign. Not just to destroy infrastructure, not just to disrupt supply chains, but to bring the war home to the Russian population in a way that the Kremlin cannot indefinitely suppress or explain away. Now we turn to Putin's response, because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely alarming. In the days following Ukraine's most expansive deep strike operations, Putin did several things simultaneously. He tested a new nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile. He announced it would be deployed by the end of 2026. Analysts questioned some of the technical claims he made about the weapon's capabilities. But the timing of the test, conducted at the precise moment when Ukrainian drones were reaching Orenburg and Moscow, was not accidental. He issued a Victory Day speech calling Russia's cause just and declaring victory inevitable, while presiding over the most scaled-down military parade in modern Russian history, a ceremony stripped of its traditional columns of tanks and missile carriers because those assets are needed at the front line, and because the optics of parading through Moscow while Ukrainian drones circle overhead would have been catastrophic. He suggested for the first time publicly that he was open to meeting Zelensky in a third country. He described the war as coming to an end. His spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, echoed these themes, speaking of accumulated groundwork in the peace process and suggesting completion was approaching. And simultaneously, Russia launched its largest monthly drone barrage against Ukraine in the history of the war, over 9,000 attack drones in a single month. This combination, nuclear signaling, peace theater, and maximum military pressure, is not a contradiction. It is a strategy. It is the most coherent and dangerous strategy Putin has available to him at this stage of the conflict. Here is how it works. The nuclear signaling is designed to establish a ceiling on Western support for Ukraine. Every time Putin tests a nuclear-capable weapon or references Russia's nuclear arsenal, he is sending a message to Washington, Brussels, and Ottawa. There is a point beyond which supporting Ukraine becomes too dangerous. He is trying to define that point in Western minds before Ukraine crosses it. He is trying to create a zone of restraint, a boundary beyond which Western governments will hesitate to go, that gives Russia a military advantage it cannot achieve through conventional means alone. The peace theater is designed to divide Ukraine's coalition. If Russia appears to be seeking a diplomatic solution while Ukraine continues striking Moscow with drones, it becomes easier for political forces in Western capitals, forces already skeptical of the enormous financial commitment to Ukraine, to argue that Kiev is prolonging the war unnecessarily. It creates domestic political pressure in the United States, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in any country where there is significant public skepticism about the cost of supporting Ukraine. And the maximum military pressure, the 9,000 drones, the guided bombs, the missile strikes on Kiev, is designed to exhaust Ukraine's air defense resources, break civilian morale, and destroy the energy infrastructure that Ukrainian society depends on to function. Even as winter approaches, Even as Ukrainian energy experts warn that rebuilding electrical capacity will take years in the best case, Russia continues to target the power plants, substations, and transmission lines that keep hospitals running and homes heated. This is Putin's most dangerous move, not because any single element of it is unprecedented, but because of what it represents in combination. A leader who signals nuclear readiness while pursuing conventional escalation, while performing diplomatic openness, while his economy slowly degrades and his military suffers catastrophic casualties. That is a leader who is running out of options. And a leader running out of options is the most unpredictable and therefore most dangerous actor in any geopolitical crisis. Western intelligence assessments, shared cautiously among NATO allies, paint a picture of a Kremlin increasingly consumed by internal anxiety. Russia's top military commanders, according to reporting in the Financial Times, have convinced Putin that their forces can ultimately prevail, but the confidence projected publicly does not match the private calculations being made in Moscow. The economic data does not support optimism. The casualty data does not support optimism. The battlefield data does not support optimism. What supports the projection of optimism is the alternative, which is admitting to the Russian public that the war was a catastrophic miscalculation that has consumed 1 million soldiers, hollowed out the defense budget, isolated Russia internationally, and delivered none of the strategic objectives Putin set when he ordered the invasion on February 24, 2022. That admission is not survivable politically for Putin. And so the war continues, and the drones keep flying, in both directions. Now let us examine what Zelensky's 1,500-kilometer reach actually means for the trajectory of this conflict, because it changes the strategic calculus in ways that have not yet been fully absorbed by Western policymakers. The traditional model of this war, Russian advances compensated by Western weapons supplies to Ukraine, a grinding attritional conflict with a slowly moving front line, is being disrupted by Ukraine's expanding deep strike capability. And that disruption cuts both ways. On the one hand, it gives Ukraine a lever that does not depend on frontline breakthroughs. Even without recapturing large amounts of territory, Ukraine can degrade Russia's war-making capacity through strikes on logistics, fuel infrastructure, military production, and economic assets. The Angstrom semiconductor plant, the oil refineries, the gas fields, these are not battlefield positions. They are nodes in the industrial system that make sustained warfare possible. Destroying them systematically, over time, reduces Russia's capacity to fight without requiring Ukraine to physically push Russian forces back across hundreds of kilometers of heavily fortified territory. On the other hand, Russia retains the ability, and the demonstrated willingness, to respond to deep Ukrainian strikes with massive attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. The pattern is consistent. Every major Ukrainian strike on Russian territory is followed by Russian attacks on Ukrainian power plants, substations, and cities. Ukraine's energy system has lost more than half its pre-war generating capacity. Rebuilding that capacity will require not months, but years. This is the strategic bind at the heart of the current phase of the war. Ukraine has the capability to make Russia's war economically and psychologically costly at unprecedented range. But Russia has the capacity to make Ukraine's civilian population pay an enormous price for every Ukrainian drone that reaches Moscow. And in the middle of this bind sits the international community, watching, funding, arming, occasionally pressuring for ceasefire, but not yet willing to provide the one thing that analysts say would genuinely change the military equation. A credible, long-term security guarantee for Ukraine. Not a promise, not a framework, a hard guarantee. The kind that would make any future Russian attack on Ukraine carry consequences severe enough to deter it. Until that guarantee exists, Zelensky will keep striking, because the alternative, accepting a ceasefire without security guarantees, is simply to pause the war while Russia recovers and prepares for the next round. And Putin will keep escalating, because the alternative, accepting a settlement that does not deliver the territorial and strategic objectives that justified the war to the Russian public, is politically unsurvivable. 1,500 kilometers. That is how far Ukraine's drones are reaching into Russian territory today. The question that should occupy every serious mind in Washington, Ottawa, and Brussels is this: how far will this war reach before it ends? And what will be left of the international order when it does?